has been a very important country in strengthening global harmonization, not only in the implementation of regulatory systems, but also in the capacity building for a global supply chain in manufacturing. And a very good example of that is the Global Center for Biopharmaceuticals Training that was established between WHO and the government of Republic of Korea. I had the pleasure to be here in Seoul in different capacities before, one of them in terms of the Biopharmaceutical Center. But I have also the big pleasure to share the history of MFDS becoming first an ML4 and then becoming a WLA, which is one of the success cases in our history in recent years, and a great contributor for what WLA will be in the future, WHO Listed Authorities Framework, in terms of capacity to oversight a global supply chain that will respond to the problems that we have in the planet in terms of global health. Global health is being under threat, not only because of dramatic events like COVID-19, but certainly because of inequality in access to affordable and quality-assured medical products. And the role of regulatory systems is absolutely essential, bringing the capacity for oversight in order to have a level playing field in terms of access everywhere in the world. So Korea has been at the center of that battle for global health in terms of the products, and I wish to welcome and to thank you not only the government of Republic of Korea, the regulators, but also the manufacturers and the scientific community in Republic of Korea that brought a very structured response during COVID-19 in a number of different aspects, being at the forefront of the development of diagnostics, vaccines, and other health products that were necessary and absolutely essential for COVID-19. I'm not going to talk too much about pharmacovigilance. Anna Laura Salvati will talk about that in the context of WLA later on. So in my presentation here, and I hope to save a couple of minutes for a fruitful discussion, I will be presenting on the WLA framework, just to give common information to everybody in the room. I know that for some of you this information is not new, for some of you it's completely new. And before we move in our sessions, it's important to have an information, a baseline of information common to everybody in the room and also following us online. So I'll go through three main points during my presentation. The first one will be an overview of the WLA evaluation and designation process. So first of all, we need to be clear in some of the preconditions before we moved to WHO Listed Authorities Framework. What we had in recent decades was a system by which we had pre-qualification established since 1986 for vaccines and then expanded to medicines and other health products. But pre-qualification was established mostly looking at the UN procurement services, UNICEF and others, but also at national procurement systems. And let me say this very clearly to avoid any misconception. I'm the director of the Regulation and Pre-Qualification Department at WHO. I would be the most happy person in the world if I could announce today the end of pre-qualification of WHO, because that would have meant that we had strong regulatory capacity all over the world. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And we might need WHO to continue with pre-qualification for another couple of decades because of the unsuccessful cases in regulatory oversight that we are seeing all over the world. Having said that, we need also to recognize that we had major failures in the recent decades, and one of them is being a political compromise, not based on technical data, not based on assessment, which was the context of recognizing a number of regulatory authorities as stringent regulatory authorities. That definition of stringent regulatory authorities, or SRAs, was a political decision. a political decision taken by procurement agencies, agreed by WHO, but not based on facts. And let me give two examples. I'm not going to give the example of Republic of Korea because you all know that, but the example of Japan. Japan is a founding member of ICH. There was no doubt of the adherence to international standards from the beginning, but Japan was not recognized as an SRA for vaccines. So it was a political decision, an imperfect decision, but allowed us for a number of decades to have some recognition mechanisms and some reliance mechanisms based mostly on historical relations between regulatory agencies and not based on data, not based on assessment of the reality of the regulatory systems. So this very imperfect system needed to have a solution. So there's a number of discussions that were held. You have a summary of some historical data there, how we arrived to the decision on WLA at some moment in time, mostly around the period 2016-2018. But then we had a problem also, which would have been how to implement WLA. And first of all, WLA is something that WHO considers as the centerpiece of reliance mechanisms all over the world in medical products, for the regulatory oversight of medical products. So it needs to be a strong system. It is a strong system now, but at the beginning, the main challenge was that it needed to be a strong system based on data, based on facts, based on an external independent assessment. And as you know, it's not easy for organizations, even for WHO, which is a member states organization. We are a facilitator. We don't rule the governments of the countries that are part of WHO. We are ruled by the countries that are part of WHO. It's not easy to move from a system where you don't have anything absolutely in terms of the plain level field to establish something that becomes an independent standard and a very independent in terms of the assessment that is done. So there's a number of rules that were established along the process. These are probably the main dates on that historical process. There's one date missing there, which is the critical date that we are living right now, which is March 22. During that process, moving from the concept note to the WLA policy and the WLA operational guidance, we decided to start the transition for WLA in March 2022 for a period of 5 years, which means that in March 22, we had to take the political decision to consider as candidates for the TWLA a number of countries that had their regulatory systems recognized by WHO under different formats that were based mostly on historical data. First of all, the regional reference authorities of the region of the Americas, and to recognize that the PAHO revolving fund is based on the criteria for the PAHO revolving fund were based on rules established by PAHO, and PAHO is an organization that started in 1906 and that preceded WHO before its integration of the region of the Americas inside WHO in 1948. Then secondly, the regulatory agencies for the oversight of vaccine manufacturers. And we still have historically 2 regulators from that category that even today are not ML3, so still on that transition phase, which are the regulators from the Russian Federation and Islamic Republic of Iran. Others like India, like Vietnam, like China have moved to ML3 during the process, but those 2 are still on the old system pre-2016. That served, for example, for procurement by UNICEF for vaccines, together with pre-qualification, and as a precondition to access to pre-qualification. Then the third category is, of course, the SRAs, being an imperfect definition, but a recognition that was there. And the fourth one, the ML3s and ML4, that were established post-2016. And the first one, the first ML3 post-2016, was the recognition of the regulatory system for oversight of vaccine manufacturers in India. It was the first one to transit to ML3 at the beginning of the process. So these 4 categories, which is a total of 56 regulatory authorities, we decided in March 2022 to put them on the transitional WLA, giving them 5 years to transit to WLA, or in alternative, to be benchmarked against the global benchmarking tool, having a minimum level of maturity level 3. If neither of the conditions would be met, then the products and the consequences of not recognition from WHO would be enforced from 31st of March 2027. So typically that means that the regulatory agencies for the reference regulatory agencies from the region of the Americas, for example, would lose access to the revolving fund. And this is an independent decision not taken by WHO HQ, but by the regional committee of WHO from the region of the Americas that decided that the regulators that will not be ML3 at the end of the transition period would not be included on the revolving fund. So this is a problem to be solved in the next 2 years. But also, for example, and just to give you one example for you to illustrate the public health impact of these measures, currently 50% of the stockpile of the yellow fever vaccine comes from a Russian manufacturer, Shumakov, which means that if Russian Federation will not be ML3 by 31st of March 2027, the vaccine for yellow fever from Shumakov will be delisted from pre-qualification, and UNICEF will have a problem that impacts 50% of the stockpile. And that's why there's a number of countermeasures that are being implemented, not only the reinforcement of the regulatory system in the Russian Federation, which has a major challenge because inspections are not under the control of the regulatory system, but under the control of the Minister of Industry and Economical Development, but also looking at the capacity to produce yellow fever vaccines, for example, in the Institut Pasteur in Dakar, that is speeding up their manufacturing capacity, and other manufacturers in the world that are currently developing yellow fever vaccines just in anticipation of a potential catastrophic event that will come from the non-strengthening of the regulatory system by the Russian Federation by March 2027. So just to give an illustration that these are not administrative regulatory issues, these are real-world problems that impact real people with real public health problems, because we know that when regulatory systems don't work, people die. And we had recently dramatic events since 2022 with contamination on ethylene glycol in a number of products that remember us the beginning of the modern regulatory systems. Just to remember all in the room that the Food and Drug Act at the United States of the Americas in the 1930s was established after several US citizens were killed with an elixir of sulfanilamide contaminated with ethylene glycol and ethylene glycol. And a century after, we are still dealing with the same problems. So, just to give you a perspective that this is a very intense work on the backstage in terms of bringing the different factors in public health with the regulatory harmonization, recognizing always that the role of WHO is to support member states, not to govern member states, and that all of these processes are, of course, voluntary, but voluntary processes that have consequences. Consequences in supply chain, consequences in access, consequences in the positioning of products in the global markets. So the objectives of the WLA initiative are to provide a transparent and evidence-based pathway for the regulatory authorities to be globally recognized, to promote access and supply of safe, effective, and quality medical products, to optimize the use of limited resources by facilitating reliance. And reliance is the most important criteria for the future. We all know that we are far away from a situation that we will have 194 member states of WHO with at least maturity level 3, and a huge considerable number of them to be WLAs. I think that the second condition to have a critical mass of WLAs, we are already there, but we can do better. In terms of having all 194 at maturity level 3. It's something that is not going to happen in the near future. That's why it's so critical to have regional integrated regulatory systems being integrated in an almost complete manner, like it is the case of the European Union, which is very close, not being a federal union, it's very close to be a federal integrated system, or more loose systems than the system that is being developed right now by the African Union in the context of the African Medicines Agency, which is more based on the work of the national regulatory authorities, simply for the fact that the African Union is not the European Union because it doesn't have a legal mandate to enforce and to force to have marketing authorizations by the member states. So whatever will be the final setup for the African Medicines Agency, because of that legal issue that is there, and it's a constitutional issue for the African Union, the African Medicines Agency will never be operating in the same rules and procedures as the European Medicines Agency. It will be a different one, adapted to the reality of the African Union and the relation between the member states there. The most important being to recognize that reliance between a core of member states that will be with adequate regulatory capacity will be the major keystone, the major cornerstone for the African medicines regulatory system. And also to say that this is not built on the void, is built on existing experience of 16 years, already 16 years for the African medicines regulatory harmonization scheme that WHO, together with AUDA, NEPAD, and others, have been supporting a lot. So what is the relation between GBT and WLA? Well, GBT is a capacity building mechanism. It's not a certification scheme. So GBT was not built, was not designed for reliance on procurement processes. It was designed to give minimum capacity. What are the consequences in terms of procurement? Well, I would say one, because you need to be ML3 on vaccines to submit to pre-qualification. Explaining in another way, you can only submit vaccines for pre-qualification if the first approval is a regulatory agency that is ML3. Why we have that rule for vaccines and not for medicines? For a simple reason. Because on vaccines, we need to have an official lot release by a regulatory authority. And if the regulatory authority is non-functional, it's no matter to start to do a pre-qualification of the vaccine because we cannot have a control over the lot release without integrating the national regulatory authority. That's why the systems in access to pre-qualification are different from medicines to vaccines. In medicines, just to give the two most dramatic examples of countries that represent 80% of the supply chain for low and medium income countries, which are India and China. We, WHO, we don't recognize the regulatory systems for medicines in India and China. They are fragmented, implemented with different criteria by the states in India or by the provinces in China. I'm flying from Seoul to Shanghai the day after tomorrow to meet the Deputy Minister of Health and the Deputy Commissioner of NMPA to continue the dialogue on how to solve that problem. And we are engaging the same dialogue with the government of India, but it's not done. It's far from done. And in that case, China and India, the medicines that are pre-qualified by WHO replaces the regulatory authority in everything. That means, for example, the follow-up GMP inspections to look at the manufacturing capacity and status of those products will not be done by the national regulatory authorities, but done by WHO. And I can tell you that is a pain in my operation, because in any single day, I have always 90% of my inspectors either in India or in China every single day. And this is a very complex operation for us to do, something that we would be very glad to stop, but that we will only stop the day that India and China would move on the right direction, and not one day before that. So GBT was built for capacity building, not for procurement. What is built to reliance on procurement is WHO-listed authorities. And the difference between the two is that ML3 or ML4 is a precondition to submit to WLA. You cannot submit to WLA before you reach ML3 or ML4 status. And contrary to the 265 indicators for the 8 or 9 regulatory functions, depending if you are on medicines or vaccines, to become ML3 or ML4, you have then a set of 40 indicators to move on the performance evaluation for WHO listed authorities framework. Of course, we want to build reliance mechanisms between these different contexts, but they are partial or full reliance mechanisms depending on the status that you are. Just to give an example, the Expert Committee for Standards and Pharmaceutical Products at WHO that met last week took the decision to accept the proposal from the Secretary at the WHO that in future the pre-qualification to be implemented from 1st of January, the abridged pre-qualification for medicines, because ECSPP only rules on medicines, ECBS for biological standards rules on vaccines and biologicals. So the SPP already took the decision that abridged pre-qualification will be open now for WLAs. It was open for SRAs based on a political decision. It will be open now for WLAs, but only for full WLAs, which means that to have a product that is candidate for a bridge pre-qualification, a medicinal product, the National Regulatory Authority of Oversight needs to be WLA for all 8 functions in the case of medicines, or in the future, 9 functions in the case of vaccines. We'll deal with the vaccines on an ad hoc extraordinary meeting of the Expert Committee of Biological Standards that will be held before the end of March 2026. We are currently re-engineering the entire procedures for regulation and pre-qualification at WHO following the recent restructuring of WHO. And one of the major consequences will be that we'll have 2 ad hoc committees on Q1 2026 to complete the reform of pre-qualification where these aspects will be dealt with. So, major objectives: supporting quality of medicines and vaccines through the WLA initiative, promoting reliance, promoting networking and collaboration, information sharing, strengthening of regulatory capacity, transparency. Let me share here with you something that normally we don't have the opportunity to share, and I think that permanent dialogue and transparency are the only factors that can build trust. I'm the person that when things go wrong, I have to come to a country. So I always say to my friends on regulatory authorities, don't ask me to come, because when I come normally, it's not for good reasons, it's to solve problems. And I'm also the one that needs to sit next to the Director General in the presser when things go wrong to explain why things went not on the expected direction. So in that context, when we were finalizing the WLA evaluation for the European Union regulatory system and for the US regulatory system, I was the one that had 7 scenarios in my flip chart with the narratives prepared to communicate with the media, because I can guarantee you that I was only convinced that both US FDA and European medicines regulatory system would be full WLA at 7 a.m. in the morning of the second day of the expert committee that was considering that. And why? Not because of any technical reasons. We are talking about 2 of the strongest regulatory systems in the world, but because of information sharing and transparency. And this is a reality that in major regulatory authorities are not yet at ease with complete transparency and sharing of information with other regulators. And if you don't comply with those rules, you cannot be a WLA, as simple as that. WLA needs to be a very strong system. Republic of Korea has a great experience because it started first with an ML4 and then moving to WLA, and first to be WLA at almost all functions, but not all functions. And the remaining functions, I was here in 2023 on a media presser, I think with a number of our colleagues that are in the room, to explain to the media why the fact that Republic of Korea MFDS, being an ML4 but not a full WLA, was not related with the capacity of the regulatory agency, but with a number of issues that needed to be solved in terms of the structure of the regulatory system before we move to the final stage. So it's a complex process, it's a strong process, it's a detailed process, and it's a fact-based, science-driven process. And just to share that with you, in average, because you are not exposed to that reality, in average, a report for a regulatory authority before it goes to the technical advisory group on WLA, that is an independent panel that gives the final recommendation to the leadership of WHO. That report from our colleagues at the Regulatory System Strengthening team normally has between 600 and 900 pages per regulatory authority. So it's a detailed, thorough assessment, and it needs to be that. And that's building that strong assessment that we build also a strong system through those reliance mechanisms that we need to implement. So the expected impact of the WLA initiative, there are multiple. I referred already some of them. The slides will be shared with the audience for you to go in more details, because there are a number of details in the slides that I cannot go into many details because of the limitation of time that we have, and I want to reserve some space also for some dialogue. But very important, what I referred already in the contribution for the PQ program, and also to enable efficient use of regulatory resources, fostering health equity, encouraging continuous improvement and regulatory convergence, and also helping on a solid base, on a fact base, science-driven base, the procurement decisions. So this is what I just mentioned on the SPP, approved October 20, so a couple of days ago, and that establishes the mechanism to move to pre-qualification. Also, a number of differences, I will not go now on the details, between the maturity level of GBT and the WLA, but as I mentioned before, WLA is on top of GBT, more focused on the performance evaluation of the regulatory system, which is different from the logic of the indicators and sub-indicators that are established, a total of close to 265 for ML3 and ML4. The purpose of GBT is to verify the establishment, appropriateness, and implementation of the regulatory processes, procedures, and plans. The purpose of WLA is to measure performance and impact of regulations, processes, procedures, and plans. And that makes a lot of difference when we go then for the reliance mechanisms, because what we need at the reliance mechanism is the second one, is really the impact coming from WLA. That doesn't mean that we don't have other reliance mechanisms. We have. We have the EU Medicines for All process. We have the Swiss Medic reliance mechanisms for faster approval for a number of regions in the world. We have the collaborative registration procedure supported by WHO and facilitating the national regulatory approval by both pre-qualification or, in the past, SRA, from now, WLA approved products that can go faster for national regulatory approval. We have still some challenges with CRP, and one of the challenges of CRP is that some countries want to participate on CRP, still imposing a reassessment at the national level or a re-inspection at the national level. That's not a reliance mechanism. That's not what CRP was designed for. And countries that are not yet ML3 and implementing those practices, I can guarantee you they will not be ML3, because simply they are not adopting the good reliance practices that WHO is putting forward. So why those countries are still trying to continue to replicate those efforts, which are spending resources that could be allocated elsewhere, and are replicating evaluations that were already done, simply, and we need to recognize the difficulty, because of budgetary issues, because redoing an inspection or redoing an evaluation brings a fee associated, and that is important in some constituencies for the survival of some weak regulatory agencies that otherwise don't have a strong financial support. That's why we are recommending the member states to establish a sound base for the political and financial independence of the regulatory authorities as part of the ML3, ML4 process and before they can be candidates for WLA. You need to have a regulatory agency that is not depending on political decisions, even for its budget, in order to be an independent regulator. If you are always crippled by political pressure on your budget, you cannot really be an independent regulatory authority in the full acception of the word and the concepts that we need to implement on a regulatory system. So this is the WHO listing process in all its details. It's, as I said, a very detailed process, a strong process that has at the end a recommendation approved by a technical advisory group, 15 people that are with a fixed mandate independent from WHO, with special rules on conflicts of interest. For example, just to give you 2 examples, the head of the Nigeria regulatory system, NAFDAC, Professor Moji, is part of that panel. If Nigeria would be to be assessed by that panel in the coming period, she would have to be removed from the discussion. Sorry, Petra Dor, that is the executive director of EDQM, had to be removed from the discussion during the European regulatory system, and so forth. So we have a very clear, transparent, published on the website, declaration of interest of the members of the panel, rules and transparency of procedure. It's a real independent panel that takes the final recommendation. So the fact that we might be inclined to say that that country is at WLA level or it's not at WLA level, it's only an opinion from the Secretariat, it's not a decision. The decision by the Assistant Director General and the Director General of WHO under the recommendation of the Director of the Department is only considered after a positive recommendation from the TAG WLA. So there's no room in the procedure to have a positive decision against a negative decision from the Technical Advisory Group. So in that respect, a very independent process with the checks and balances that are needed there. Eligibility criteria, I talked already a bit about this. The listing process, so it's published, it's transparent. The designation is initially valid for a defined period of years, basically depending on the situations between 3 and 5 years. We try to put it uniform as 5 years, except if there's any concern to put a shorter period of time. The principle of the mechanism and established on the policy that was published is that after the first 5 years, with a second designation as WLA, that becomes permanent, which means there will be no further reassessment of the status because it's considered the regulatory system is on a continuous improvement cycle and doesn't need anyone to shepherd it in the future. Does it mean that WHO loses all control? No. WHO has always the capacity to go back and to verify the implementation of the procedures that were assessed during WLA, and if there is any deviation with lower standards being implemented in the future, WHO can at any moment delist a WLA from the official with a justified procedure and a justified report looking at rules that were breached by the regulatory agency. Just to give an example that we might need to implement very soon is the case of the US Food and Drug Administration. By executive order of the President of the United States, it was announced in January this year that the US will be leaving WHO in January 2026. That by itself is not a trigger for delisting of the US FDA from the WLA. Why? Because we have already a non-member state as WLA, which is Liechtenstein. Liechtenstein is part of the European regulatory system. The regulatory system of the European Union is integrated with procedures at 3 different levels. We needed to assess the entire system, but also country by country. but it's technically and legally impossible to not list Liechtenstein in the process. So that procedure created also a legal argument that a non-member state, or a member state becoming a non-member state, will not be a trigger to delist from WLA. What will be a trigger to delist from WLA will be the stop of technical relation from the US FDA with WHO and not sharing inspection reports, not sharing evaluation reports for the reliance mechanisms. And that being US FDA or any other WLA at any moment, that will constitute the basis for a trigger of a delisting by WHO from the WLA. It didn't happen yet because even though the government of the United States through the president published that executive order in January 2025, in May 2025, the President of the United States signed a waiver for that executive order only for pre-qualification. So it means that since May, we are back on a normal operation with US FDA and no infringement on the reliance mechanisms as established by the WLA. That waiver is valid only until January 26. So if in January 26 we go back to the previous situation in January 25 with a shutdown of technical relations between WHO and the US government and US FDA, then it will be my responsibility as director to propose to the Director General of WHO the publication of the delisting of the US FDA from the WLA mechanism. I think that with a specific example, you understand much better how the system has a number of checks and balances, and the role of WHO is to keep the integrity of the principles, the norms and standards, and the rules of engagement on the WLA, ensuring that WLA is a reference forever, because those that will be WLA, if they infringe the rules, they will be kicked out. As simple as that. So this is the different components of the performance evaluation process. A number of references for the indicators I mentioned before. The clock for the transitional arrangements that I mentioned already. The clock was activated on 31st of March 22. It will be stopped on 31st of March 27. And I mentioned already the three main problems that we have and that we know that we'll have in 31st of March 27. Some of the reference regulatory authorities from the region of the Americas, the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Russian Federation might be the three that will not complete at least an ML3 by 31st of March 2027, and in that respect, they will have to be not considered anymore for any recognition mechanism by WHO. So these were basically the objectives of the transitional arrangements, recognizing the achievements and work of all regulatory agencies on the interim list to protect the global supply chain and pre-qualified products, to provide a clear and transparent path, to ensure processes that are feasible and efficient with respect to WHO and regulatory authorities' capacity. This was really the principles and key steps. It's a very dense slide. I'm not going to go in any of those aspects, but just point you for going back to the slide once you get access to the slides to go in more further detail. Some of those aspects I've been referring them already. The transitional, as I mentioned already before. So during the transitional, we have three main approaches for WLA, which is the routine arrangements with a full WLA assessment for those that were ML3 or ML4, transitional arrangements for the abridged WLA for the SRAs, considering a more light assessment, and then a streamlined assessment for those that were ML3, ML4, or functional regulatory agencies. And I have to say that in this case, we had also three pilots testing the three different ways of moving forward. One of them was Switzerland as an SRA. The other one was Singapore, being ML4 only for medicines. and the other one being Republic of Korea, being ML4 for medicines and vaccines. So these three countries were, I would say, the testing probe for the implementation of the operational guidance of WLA, and that's why the operational guidance was published later than 31st of March 2022, because the operational guidance is also the result of the validation of the methods we used for the assessment using those three countries and those three different situations to complete the operational guidance. So it's a process that was validated before being expanded on a stepwise approach. This is the way we did it. This is the description mostly for the streamlined pathway. I'm not going on the details, the abridged pathway, and the risk-based assessment with examples of a number of recognition mechanisms there. So these are the estimated guidelines. The problem with the guidelines, the timelines, is that sometimes those timelines are expanded when we find a reasonable reason to expand the time, to give more time to the regulatory authority in question to provide evidence. Our first rule is to engage, not really to stop the dialogue at a certain moment in time. But I think these are very good for people that are planning to go to WLA, to have an estimation of the different phases and the engagement, the different engagement you need to do at different phases with some reference timelines there. So the listing is not a one-shot process. As I referred before, you can do it only for a couple of functions. There's one basic rule, is that you cannot be WLA if your function regulatory system, which is the first function, is not at the level of WLA. If you are at the level of WLA with inspections or with pharmacovigilance, with any other function, but you are not on RS, regulatory system first function, then you cannot be WLA. If you are at WLA level with RS, contrary to what happens in ML3 and ML4, where you need to be all functions ML3 or all functions ML4, here on WLA you can add successive functions. This was the case for Singapore and Republic of Korea that were not completed, and now they are completed after a 2 years period. This is the case for MHRA UK, that is WLA for all functions except market surveillance and control, because of a number of decisions taken by the UK government in recent years that impacted that function, and they are now changing, they changed already the legislation after the last decision of the TAC WLA not to give them the MSC function, and they are now in the implementation phase. We hope to have collected sufficient evidence of data to have a decision before the end of the year for the MHRA UK to complete the WLA for all functions. So, but the critical rule there is RS, so regulatory system function. You need to have it really at WLA level. My honest opinion about what is the major problem with that function for a number of countries, quality management system. Not the only one, but probably one of the critical ones where a number of strong regulatory agencies still fail in having a strong quality management system, something that should be basic, but it's much more difficult than we can discuss at some moment in time. Then, of course, if you are not WLA for all functions, as I explained before, you cannot access a bridge PQ. That's a simple rule. We had a huge discussion about this internally at the department and with the technical experts before we submitted the proposal for the expert committees. Honestly, it would have been a very dangerous avenue to choose any other way to move forward. And this is this workshop as a central topic on pharmacovigilance. What does it mean that we can consider the bridge PQ for products approved by a regulatory agency that is not WLA in pharmacovigilance? Does it have the necessary capacity for the life cycle management of the medical product? Certainly not. So why it should be abridged? So we need to be very clear on the terms of reference to what we are doing, and I think that the experience with these first 3 years of implementation of WLA, and now that we are less than 2 years, we are basically 18 months to the end of the transitional phase, and we know exactly those that might fail and those that might do it before the end of the process, because this is a lengthy process. This is also the time to be very clear on the rules and not delaying the consequences of WLA for a bridge pre-qualification and global procurement, and this is the decisions that are being taken right now by the expert committees. So this is the composition of the TAC WLA, the functions, as I referred before, product categories, PQ relying on WLA, again, estimated timelines. So what is the current status for WLAs? We had at the start 56 national regulatory authorities and 1 regional regulatory system. This is the current picture as October 2025. You see a difference from 2022 when we initiated the process, which is a huge expansion of the light blue self-benchmarking. So a huge increase on activity on that side, which is the preparation phase for the formal benchmarking ML3 or ML4. Also a significant increase on benchmarking and on, of course, the WLA listed authorities with 36 member states now involved, 39 regulatory authorities. One of them is the European Union that is a regional system. The other one is Liechtenstein, which is not a member state. And in one specific member state, we have 2 regulatory authorities, which is Germany with BfArM for chemical products and the Paul Ehrlich Institute for Biologics and Vaccines. So in total, 39 regulatory authorities from 36 member states, 37 countries, including Liechtenstein. Benchmarking expanded, self-benchmarking hugely expanded. So we can anticipate a next cycle in which we will not only conclude with a couple more of countries becoming WLAs, but with a huge expansion of ML3 and ML4 through the efforts that are being done in terms of self-benchmarking. Let me say this also. So this is the most recent ones. In 2025, in July 2025, Canada, all functions, UK, MHRA, all functions except market surveillance and control, Japan, 4 functions only, and only for medicines, because vaccines were not considered SRA, they would not qualify for the transitional WLA at this moment in time, so they need to go, because of that political decision that was taken in the past, they will now need to go through an entire GBT cycle to become ML3 or ML4 on vaccines before they can submit to WLA, and Republic of Korea and Singapore completed the remaining functions for being now full WLAs. The picture is like this. We have currently 68% of the member states of WHO that still don't have a functional regulatory system. These numbers need to be put in perspective. It means that since 2016, we moved roughly 50% of the world population under regulated systems. The problem is that on those 50%, we count India and China because of the vaccines regulatory system. But India and China, we don't consider them on the medicines regulatory system. The other caveat is this number. 68% of the member states still don't have a functional regulatory system. So a huge work still to be done on the capacity building of regulatory systems and in complement with the WLA. So it's unavoidable that we need those reliance mechanisms. Let me come back to this chart. We have, and let me be very transparent here, we have 3 situations in the world where I can say today that it's almost impossible to build strong national regulatory systems. And it's important to look at the 3 at the same moment because the 3 are geographical dispersed with different socioeconomical development indicators. So it's not related with the circumstance of the country. It's related with the critical mass of the country. And those three regions are the small Pacific Islands, the Gulf states, and the Caribbean islands. In these three situations, it's almost impossible to have strong regulatory systems at the national level, because building capacity at the country alone, it's a challenge. You don't have enough resources, you don't have enough critical mass, you don't have enough support from a scientific system or whatever. It will be almost completely impossible. So the only way to move forward on these three regions is really through integrated regional regulatory systems. This is our strong recommendation for these three regions. And I think that what we are seeing in Africa is a game changer, because the regulatory system that will be built around the African Medicines Agency is not the European Union system, is a completely different system, but a system that, based on the national resources, builds also the capacity at the regional level, not losing the sovereignty at the national level, which is one of the criticisms that you can do to the European system, because the dimension of legislation on medicinal products is no longer national since 1965 in Europe, is only at European level. So in that respect, the member states lost sovereignty in taking decisions in the legal system. This is not the case in Africa. This doesn't need to be the case in these three regions. That's why the system that is being built in Africa, it's certainly very important for Africa, but it's certainly also very important for lessons to be taken to other regions, because if you look at that map, and you look at those three regions plus the African Medicines Agency, most of our work will be done if these four issues are solved in one specific historical moment. And this is what we have been working for. So this is the global status that we have right now. And this is the map that we like to look to have that critical dimension there. This doesn't have, normally I have an animation here around the African continent. We just announced ML3 for Ethiopia. And I can tell you that we have two ML3s in Africa, which are Rwanda and Senegal, that are ML3 for medicines and imported vaccines. That might be also ML3 for oversight of manufacturing of vaccines, the moment that the manufacturing operations in vaccines are established. And this is the case for BioNTech in Rwanda and Institut Pasteur in Dakar for Senegal. At the same time, Morocco is accelerating, because they have a new major facility with a capacity for production by early next year of 100 million doses of vaccines per year with 3 manufacturing lines. And Tunisia also completed a major legal revision of the pharmaceutical law that will allow them in the very near future to move to ML3. We are waiting for good news coming from Zambia. We are waiting for good news coming from Kazakhstan. So the process is accelerating at a certain moment. And you might imagine that I had a smile in my face 2 weeks ago in Moscow, talking to the Minister of Health, Mikhail Murashko, and telling them that Kazakhstan was moving very fast to ML3, since Russia and Kazakhstan are in the same economic community, the Eurasian Economic Community. And for Russia is an additional motivation that Kazakhstan is moving fast to ML3, for Russia also to complete the process there. I think these competition mechanisms between different countries are very, very important at the regional level, because they will build up the necessary political support at the top of the government and at the top of the state in each country to support regulatory systems. And honestly, we would not be able to do that without a strong political commitment from almost all governments in the world that we have seen since February 2021, for a number of reasons, most of them related with decisions by international financial institutions, like the development banks, but that pushed the heads of state and heads of government to move fast on the direction. This is what we have been doing in terms of benchmarking a number of countries. This was, again, the decisions taken last month. Future plans, I talked about most of this, while accelerating for the end of the transitional period in 2027. This year, we normally have 2 meetings of the TAG WLA per year. The one that will be holding in December will be considering 2 countries with a potential decision. One of them is the last SRA that still is not a WLA, and it's public. You just need to go to the chart and to remove from the previous SRAs the ones that are WLAs. It's TGA from Australia that still doesn't have any function WLA. And we might be considering a decision in December about a first non-SRA, previously not in the pilots, because Korea, Singapore were not SRAs, but they were in the pilots. And that will be Baden Pom from Indonesia, that is very, very close to become WLA. In the next wave, we'll have certainly pending some political discussions I'm going to have this week in Shanghai and Beijing, but also the discussions that we initiated in Delhi in October last year. We have potentially China, India, Egypt, and South Africa to come at some moment in time for the WLA in vaccines only. Even though Egypt is already on medicines, but it will be for vaccines only. And of course, we have some problems with Russia, some problems with Iran, some problems with some South American regulatory agencies. Brazil is very active right now, and Anvisa is engaging on a discussion with us for more than a year, but still not a stage to be given the WLA at this moment in time. And as you know, in the regions of the Americas, we have 8 regulatory authorities of reference. 2 are already WLAs, Health Canada and US FDA. 1 might be it in the near future, which is Anvisa from Brazil. We still have some problems with the remaining 5. I have to say that very clear. So the next steps will be extending to medical devices, so moving from medicines and vaccines to medical devices. I cannot announce a decision here. It will be great for our colleagues from Korea if I would do the announcement in Seoul, but I cannot do that. I need to do it from Geneva. But we expect to do the announcement before the end of this year about the start of the WLA for medical devices, which will be started on a different way of what was done for medicines and vaccines at the start. So we will not do in sequence like we did in medicines and vaccines. We'll launch in parallel the first benchmarking exercises for GBT plus for medical devices, and we have currently 9 countries that are voluntary to go through that evaluation, with a 10th country that wants to discuss that with me in 2 weeks in a meeting that we have already blocked. But we will start most probably also a framework for WLA plus before the end of this year. So, but that is something that I will need to announce from Geneva and not in Seoul. It's very irresistible to do it from here, but I cannot do that. And thank you so much.